The air in Manhattan in the 1840s was not the crisp, iconic scent of a modern metropolis. It was thick with the stench of coal smoke, industrial refuse, and the suffocating overcrowding of a city bursting at its seams. New York was expanding at a pace that felt violent, a grid of stone and brick, marching relentlessly northward, devouring every inch of soil in the name of progress. Amidst this concrete fever, a few voices began to whisper, then shout about the necessity of a lungs for the city. This is the story of how a rocky, swampy wasteland became the most famous park in the world. A journey that began not with beauty, but with a desperate need for air. The visionaries like William Cullen Bryant and Andrew Jackson Downing realized that if the city did not stop to breathe, it would eventually choke on its own success. They looked at the map of Manhattan and saw a chaotic sprawl, but their eyes settled on a rugged, central spine of the island that most developers considered worthless. This land was a jagged mosaic of gneiss rock, stagnant marshes, and shantytowns where the marginalized immigrants and free African Americans had built lives far from the prying eyes of the elite. By 1853, the New York State Legislature took a step that was unprecedented in American history. They designated 778 acres of land in the center of Manhattan for a public park. It was a massive gamble. To the wealthy landowners, it was a waste of prime real estate. To the thousands of people living on that land, particularly in the thriving community of Seneca Village, it was a death sentence for their homes. Seneca Village was a rare sanctuary, a place where black New Yorkers owned property and had built churches and schools, yet the progress of the People's Park demanded their displacement. The tension was palpable as the city used eminent domain to clear the land, a dark chapter in the park's birth that often goes whispered in the shadows of its grand arches. As the land was cleared, the sheer impossibility of the task became clear. This wasn't a park. It was a wilderness of mud and granite. The city announced a competition, the Central Park Commission's design contest, to find a plan that could tame this beast. Enter Frederick Law Olmsted, a man who had been a seaman, a farmer, and a journalist, but never a landscape architect, and Calvert Vaux, a brilliant British architect who understood the soul of a structure. Together, they submitted the Greensward Plan. Their philosophy was revolutionary. They didn't want a formal European garden for the elite. They wanted a democratic space where a banker and a baker could walk the same path and feel equalized by the majesty of nature. They envisioned sweeping meadows, hidden grottos, and sunken transverse roads so that the vile traffic of the city would never interrupt the serenity of the park-goer. When they won the commission in 1858, the real war began. It was a war against the very geology of New York. Thousands of Irish and German laborers were hired, not just to plant trees, but to move mountains. They used more gunpowder to blast through the Manhattan schist of Central Park than was used at the Battle of Gettysburg. Every inch of the landscape we see today was choreographed. The lakes were carved out of swamps, the hills were built from the debris of the blasts, and the soil was hauled in from across the state because the original ground was too acidic to sustain the millions of plants Olmsted envisioned. As the first sections opened to the public, the city watched in awe. People who had spent their entire lives in dark tenements stepped onto the mall and looked up at the towering elms, feeling for the first time that the city belonged to them. But the dream was fragile. Olmsted and Vaux fought constant battles with corrupt politicians, particularly the infamous Tammany Hall machine, which saw the park's massive budget as a personal piggy bank. The struggle to keep the park pure from political statues and commercial ventures was a daily grind that nearly broke Olmsted's spirit. Yet, as the sun set over the newly finished Bethesda Terrace in those early years, the reflection in the water told a story of a city that had finally found its heart. Even if that heart was built on the ruins of the homes it had swept, a way to make room for the trees. As the 1860s dawned, Central Park was no longer just a blueprint or a construction site. It was becoming a living, breathing entity, even as the shadow of the American Civil War loomed over the nation. While the rest of the country prepared for battle, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux were engaged in a different kind of combat, a fight to ensure that their greensward vision survived the twin threats of political corruption and the sheer logistical nightmare of the park's terrain. Work became an exercise in industrial-scale artistry. To create the illusion of a timeless natural wilderness, the laborers had to perform feats of engineering that rivaled the building of the pyramids. One of the most significant challenges was the transverse roads. Olmsted was adamant that the park should be a sanctuary, completely insulated from the sights and sounds of city traffic. To achieve this, he insisted on sinking the 4 main crosstown roads into deep, stone-lined trenches. This allowed carriages and commercial wagons to pass through the park without ever being seen by those walking on the paths above. It was a pioneering concept in urban planning, the birth of the grade separated crossing, and it required the removal of hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of solid rock. Amidst this heavy lifting, Calvert Vaux began to populate the landscape with his architectural jewels. He believed that every bridge and archway should be unique, a frame for the natural beauty surrounding it. Between 1859 and 1866, dozens of bridges were constructed, each with its own personality. Some, like the elegant bow bridge with its low sweeping curve over the lake, were made of cast iron to provide a sense of lightness and grace. Others, like the trefoil arch, were heavy, rustic structures made of Manhattan schist and brick, designed to blend into the shadows of the woods. These bridges weren't just functional. They were social tools. They were designed to guide the flow of people, separating the fast-moving horses from the slow-moving pedestrians, ensuring that a stroll through the park remained a meditative experience. However, the onset of the Civil War in 1861 nearly brought the project to a standstill. Funding was diverted to the war effort, and the workforce thinned as men headed to the front lines. Yet, the park remained a symbol of hope. It was during these lean years that the terrace and Bethesda fountain began to take shape. This was intended to be the spiritual heart of the park. Vaux envisioned a grand formal plaza that would overlook the lake, a place where New Yorkers could gather in their Sunday finery. The Bethesda fountain itself, topped by the Angel of the Waters statue, was a celebration of the new Croton aqueduct system that had finally brought clean, fresh water to the city. It was the only social space in the entire park that felt grand, serving as a counterpoint to the wild, rugged ramble nearby. But the park was also beginning to attract unintended guests. As the city grew more crowded, the demand for entertainment rose. The Central Park Zoo began almost by accident during this era. It started with a collection of gifted animals, a bear cub, some deer, and a few exotic birds that were kept in cages behind the Arsenal building. Olmsted originally hated the idea. He felt that a zoo, with its noise and crowds, would ruin the quiet contemplation he had worked so hard to create. But the public's hunger for the exotic was insatiable, and the menagerie soon became one of the park's most popular attractions, forcing the designers to integrate the wildness of the animal kingdom into their carefully curated, pastoral dream. By the mid-1860s, the southern half of the park was largely complete. The Sheep Meadow, a vast expanse of emerald green, was actually home to a flock of pedigreed sheep that served a dual purpose. They were picturesque to look at, and they mowed the grass for free. This was the park at its peak of idealistic beauty. Yet, just beneath the surface, the Tammany Hall political machine, led by the notorious Boss Tweed, was tightening its grip on New York. They saw the park's massive maintenance budget as a source of graft and patronage. As Episode 2 draws to a close, the era of the visionary founders was under threat, as the Gilded Age of corruption prepared to descend upon the green oasis, threatening to turn the People's Park into a playground for the crooked. The late 1860s and 1870s ushered in an era of glitz, gold, and bone-deep corruption that nearly strangled the life out of Central Park. This was the Gilded Age, a time when New York's elite amassed fortunes beyond imagination, and the political machine known as Tammany Hall, led by the iron-fisted William Boss Tweed, treated the city's treasury like a private bank account. For Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, this was a period of heartbreak. The designers found themselves sidelined by political appointees, who cared little for pastoral tranquility and much for political patronage. Under Tweed's influence, the park's maintenance crews were replaced with political lackeys who had no knowledge of horticulture, and the once pristine lawns began to suffer. Yet, even in this era of graft, the park continued to evolve into a cultural powerhouse. becoming the setting for one of the world's most ambitious architectural undertakings, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Olmsted had originally fought against putting large buildings inside the park, fearing they would ruin the natural escape he had created. But the tide of progress was unstoppable. In 1872, the Met was granted a permanent home on the eastern edge of the park, along Fifth Avenue. The original building, a red brick Gothic structure designed by Calvert Vaux and Jacob Ray Mould, was far humbler than the massive limestone facade we see today. Its presence signaled a shift in the park's identity. It was no longer just a place to walk and breathe, but a place to be educated and civilized. The park was becoming the city's living room, a place where the rough edges of the industrial working class were meant to be smoothed over by the influence of high art and grand landscapes. During this decade, the social hierarchy of New York was on full display along the park's carriage drives. On any given afternoon, the 500, the crème de la crème of New York society, would parade in their expensive horse-drawn carriages. This was the see and be seen era. The rules were strict. There were specific paths for carriages and specific speeds to be maintained. For the wealthy, the park was a theater where they could flaunt their status. However, this elitism began to spark friction. The working class, many of whom lived in cramped tenements and worked 6 days a week, felt alienated by the park's rigid rules. You weren't allowed to play baseball on the meadows. You weren't allowed to have picnics in certain areas. You weren't even allowed to walk on the grass in many sections. The park was public, but it was governed by the Victorian sensibilities of the upper class. As the 1880s approached, the physical landscape of the park underwent a massive transformation with the completion of the Belvedere Castle. Perched atop Vista Rock, the second highest point in the park, the castle was built as a folly, a structure designed primarily for decoration and to provide a spectacular lookout point over the Croton Reservoir and the Ramble. It was a whimsical miniature castle that looked like something out of a fairy tale, but it served a dual purpose as a weather station. From its stone towers, New Yorkers could look out over the burgeoning city and see the contrast between the jagged skyline of the future and the meticulously crafted wilderness at their feet. But the beauty was deceptive. By the time Boss Tweed was finally toppled and sent to prison, the park had fallen into a state of semi-neglect. The greensward vision was being chipped away. Statues, the very things Olmsted despised as visual clutter, were being erected everywhere, as various ethnic and social groups clamored for representation. From the statue of Sir Walter Scott to the towering Egyptian obelisk known as Cleopatra's Needle, which arrived in 1881, the park was becoming a museum of stone. The obelisk, a 244-ton monument from ancient Egypt, was a feat of engineering to move, taking months to crawl from the Hudson River to its current spot behind the Met. It stood as a symbol of New York's arrival as a global power. But to Olmsted, it was another distraction from the grass and the trees. By the end of this era, the park was a paradox. It was more popular than ever, hosting millions of visitors a year, yet the original dream of a silent rural retreat was fading. The city was encroaching from all sides. The sounds of the first elevated trains could be heard from the park's borders, and the smell of the coal-fired city was never far away. The park had survived corruption and the Civil War, but it was about to face its greatest challenge, the 20th century, where the horse and carriage would be replaced by the automobile, and the quiet Victorian stroll would be replaced by the frantic energy of a modern world. The turn of the century brought a cold, harsh reality to Central Park. By the early 1900s, the Victorian elegance of the horse and carriage era was evaporating, replaced by the soot and speed of the gasoline engine. The park, once a meticulously groomed sanctuary, began to wither under the weight of a city that was growing too fast, and a government that had forgotten how to care for it. This was the era of the Great Decline. The once lush sheep meadow turned into a dust bowl. The beautiful carvings on Bethesda Terrace were chipped and covered in grime, and the intricate drainage systems designed by Olmsted began to fail, turning meadows back into the stagnant swamps they had once been. The 1920s and early 30s were particularly cruel. The Great Depression hit New York like a tidal wave, and Central Park became a mirror of the city's suffering. In the shadows of the Upper West Side's luxury apartments, the park's great lawn, which had previously been the site of a rectangular reservoir, became Hoovervilles. These were shantytowns built by the homeless and unemployed. Tiny shacks made of tin and cardboard. The People's Park had become a place of survival rather than recreation. The trees were dying from lack of pruning, and the ramble had become a dangerous thicket. It seemed that the grand experiment of 1858 was finally coming to an end. Destined to be reclaimed by the chaos of urban decay, enter Robert Moses. In 1934, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia appointed Moses as the park's commissioner, granting him nearly dictatorial powers to fix the city's crumbling infrastructure. Moses was a man of immense energy and even greater ego. He looked at Central Park not as a pastoral retreat for quiet contemplation, but as a modern recreation machine. He had no patience for Olmsted's romanticism. Within his first month, Moses fired hundreds of unmotivated staff and replaced them with a disciplined army of workers funded by the New Deal's WPA, Works Progress Administration, Moses's transformation was swift and unsentimental. He cleared out the Hoovervilles, relocated the residents, and finally filled in the old rectangular reservoir to create the great lawn we know today, a massive, flat expanse of grass designed for sports and large gatherings. He realized that the 20th century New Yorker wanted to do more than just walk. They wanted to play. He built 19 playgrounds around the perimeter of the park, ensuring that children had dedicated spaces to play safely away from the now busy streets. He renovated the zoo into a more structured, stone-walled facility and built the Wallman Rink for ice skating, adding a layer of active entertainment that the original designers had resisted. However, Moses's vision came with a cost. He was obsessed with the automobile. He paved over many of the original walking paths to widen roads and created parking lots where there had once been groves of trees. He favored concrete and asphalt over mud and grass. While he saved the park from total physical collapse, he also stripped away much of its mystery. The hidden corners were opened up, and the wild parts were tamed with chain-link fences and heavy signage. The park became cleaner and more functional, but it lost the rural soul that Olmsted had fought so hard to protect. By the end of the 1950s, the park was a bustling hub of activity, filled with the sounds of baseball games and the laughter of children in Moses's playgrounds. But a new storm was gathering. The sheer volume of people, combined with a looming fiscal crisis in New York City, meant that the Moses era of heavy construction was about to give way to another period of neglect, one that would see the park enter its darkest and most dangerous decade. The lights were about to dim on the Emerald of Manhattan. The 1960s and 1970s marked the most turbulent and terrifying chapter in the history of Central Park. If the previous era was about building a recreation machine, this era was about the machine breaking down. As New York City spiraled toward